The world woke up on the morning of June 16, 2026, to the sight of something that no modern war had yet dared to produce. The golden domes of the Kyiv Pechersk Lavra, one of the most sacred Christian monasteries on earth, wrapped in a column of black smoke and orange fire. Its thousand-year-old Dormatian cathedral burning against the dark Ukrainian sky, priests and monks scrambling through the choking haze to save irreplaceable relics and icons from the flames while firefighters battled the blaze beneath its gilded towers. And the world watched in stunned silence. Not because it was shocked that Russia would do this, but because deep down, somewhere between the diplomatic summits and ceasefire negotiations and peace framework proposals, the world had started to believe that the war might actually be ending. And Russia answered that hope with 70 cruise missiles and 611 Shahed drones in a single overnight barrage, the largest aerial bombardment of 2026, targeting not just Ukraine's military-industrial complex, but its soul, striking the Mistetsky Arsenal Art Museum, setting fire to the historic Dovzhenko film studio, and hammering residential districts across all four quadrants of Kyiv and leaving 140,000 households without electricity, while 11 Ukrainians lay dead and 53 more were wounded, including 2 children aged 5 and 7, with 5 of those dead being emergency rescue workers in Kharkiv who were killed by a second Russian missile precisely as they fought the fires from the first. A textbook Russian double-tap strike designed not just to destroy, but to terrorize, not just to kill, but to paralyze the will of anyone who dares to respond. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy walked through the smoldering wreckage of the Kyiv Pechersk Lavra in the hours after dawn, stood on the charred roof of the Dormatian Cathedral beside Prime Minister Yulius Fyodordenko, and declared to the world that this attack was one of Russia's most serious crimes against Christian culture to date, while also revealing something that stunned even seasoned diplomatic observers, that Ukraine had already sent a formal proposal through intelligence channels, diplomatic intermediaries, and back-channel mediators to Vladimir Putin, asking him to meet face-to-face on the sidelines of the G7 summit now underway in Évian-les-Bains, France, a summit attended by U.S. President Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron and all the leaders of the world's largest democratic economies. A proposal, Zelenskyy said, that the United States and Europe had agreed to and supported, a proposal that offered Putin a seat at the most powerful table on earth to negotiate an end to the bloodiest war in Europe since 1945. And Russia's answer came not in words, but in warheads. 70 missiles and 611 drones raining down on a sleeping city before Putin's aide Yuri Ushakov publicly countered with the suggestion that Zelenskyy simply travel to Moscow instead, which is not a negotiation offer, but a humiliation demand. And so the G7 summit that was supposed to be about global economic coordination becomes instead a war council, with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announcing that G7 leaders will specifically address increasing military pressure on Russia to force it toward peace talks. And the diplomatic reality that now crystallizes in Évian is this: Russia is not interested in negotiations. Russia is interested in victory. And every time the world edges toward a framework for peace, Vladimir Putin responds with a strike package designed to remind Ukraine and its allies of exactly how much pain he is still capable of inflicting. Because after more than 4 years of full-scale war, after the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, after the complete destruction of Russia's reputation as a rational international actor, Putin's calculus remains unchanged. He believes time is on his side. He believes that Western unity will fracture before Russian resolve does, and the burning monastery on the Dnieper River is his message to the G7, his answer to Zelensky's open letter, his reply to Trump's birthday phone calls and framework negotiations: more missiles, more drones, more fire. And now we shift 1,200 miles to the south and east, where a very different kind of message is being delivered, where the most consequential diplomatic development in the Middle East in decades is now just 72 hours from being signed into law, because on June 14th, a Sunday on Donald Trump's 80th birthday, the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran jointly announced that they have reached a peace agreement to formally end the 2026 Iran war, a conflict that began on February 28, when American and Israeli forces launched Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion in a coordinated surprise assault on Iranian military infrastructure, government buildings, nuclear facilities, and command centers across the country, an operation that in its first 24 hours alone unleashed 1,200 bombs on 500 Iranian military targets and assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, triggering a war that spiraled outward to engulf not just Iran and Israel, but Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, proxy militias in Iraq, and caused Iran to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes every single day, a closure that sent global energy prices surge over 40%, disrupted food and fertilizer supplies across Asia and the developing world, grounded flights across the entire Middle East, and inflicted what economists estimated to be the worst single-event oil supply shock since the 1970s energy crisis. And over the roughly 3.5 months of that war, the United States flew more than 8,000 strikes against Iranian targets, sank Iranian naval vessels, imposed a naval blockade of Iranian ports, watched Iran retaliate with hundreds of ballistic missiles and Shahed drones against Israel, U.S. military bases across Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the Kurdistan region of Iraq, experienced the destruction of THAAD missile defense radar systems, the downing of American F-15E and A-10 aircraft, the sinking of the Iranian frigate Iris Dana by a U.S. submarine in the Indian Ocean, the first time a warship had been sunk by a submarine in active combat since the Falklands War of 1982. And while the human toll mounted on both sides, with Iran reporting over 3,600 documented civilian and military deaths, the U.S. acknowledging 15 soldiers killed and more than 538 wounded, Israel counting 28 civilians and 18 soldiers dead alongside 8,524 injured, what ended all of that, or what appears to have ended all of that, was a ceasefire brokered in April by Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, an extended period of brinksmanship and dual blockades and seized cargo ships and inflammatory truth social posts, and the bizarre spectacle of a dual blockade in which the U.S. Navy blockaded Iranian ports while Iran simultaneously blockaded the Persian Gulf from the international shipping community. And through all of that chaos, Pakistan kept the channel open, kept the mediators talking, kept the Islamabad process alive even after the formal Islamabad talks collapsed in April and Trump declared he no longer cared about negotiations. And on June 14th, that process produced its result, with Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announcing on social media that following intensive talks, we are pleased to announce that the peace deal between the United States of America and Islamic Republic of Iran has been reached, and Trump confirming on the same day that the Strait of Hormuz will reopen for toll-free shipping, and Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Kazim Garibabadi confirming Tehran's acceptance, and Pakistani Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar confirming the formal signing ceremony will take place on June 19th in Geneva, Switzerland, 3 days from now, with the agreement structured as a memorandum of understanding that is intended to bring the conflict to a formal and permanent end within 60 days of the signature being affixed. And world leaders responded immediately, with French President Emmanuel Macron calling for swift and full implementation, while also notably highlighting Lebanon's involvement in the conflict as a remaining sticking point, with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcoming the framework while warning against rhetoric, provocations, and actions that could escalate tensions, and specifically cautioning all parties to remain vigilant against possible acts of sabotage before the signatures are signed. A warning that carries enormous practical weight because the history of this conflict is littered with incidents where agreements announced in Washington were undermined by strikes in Tel Aviv or Tehran within hours of the announcement, and with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese encouraging all parties to pursue lasting peace while also noting that Iran must still address long-standing concerns about its nuclear program. Because the nuclear question has not disappeared. The IAEA still cannot verify what Iran has in its remaining underground enrichment facilities. And the deal being signed in Geneva on June 19th does not appear to include a formal framework for nuclear inspections or disarmament, meaning the fundamental strategic dispute that triggered this war remains unresolved beneath the diplomatic language of the Memorandum of Understanding. And that is the shadow that hangs over everything happening in Geneva this week. Because if Iran retains the technical capacity for nuclear hedging, the ability to assemble a weapon on short notice without actually having built one, then the conditions that produced Operation Epic Fury have not been eliminated. They have simply been paused. And the world is now engaged in what will either be remembered as the beginning of a genuine regional security transformation or as another temporary ceasefire in a conflict that has been cycling through war and truce since the October 7th Hamas attacks of 2023 set off the chain of events that eventually produced February 28, 2026. And while diplomats finalize the Geneva signing ceremony and energy markets begin pricing in the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and shipping companies cautiously reroute their tanker fleets back toward the Persian Gulf, there is one force that could still unravel all of it. And that force is Israel. Because the Netanyahu government has consistently refused to accept that the ceasefire with Iran extends to Lebanon, has already launched Operation Eternal Darkness on April 8th in defiance of the ceasefire announcement, killing at least 357 people in Lebanon in what Israeli officials described as an operation to eliminate Hezbollah's command and control infrastructure. And while a Lebanon ceasefire has been in place since April 16th and extended multiple times, the Israeli Defense Ministry's stated readiness to resume operations against Iran at any moment pending U.S. authorization means the June 19th signing in Geneva will have to hold not just against Iranian hardliners and American domestic political pressure, but against a Netanyahu government that has its own strategic interests in the region that do not perfectly align with a Trump administration that is now anxious to declare victory and move on. And so we sit at this extraordinary moment in history where simultaneously, on the same planet, in the same 24-hour news cycle, Russia is burning a 1,000-year-old UNESCO World Heritage Monastery in Kyiv while world leaders gather in France to discuss how to stop it. And the United States and Iran are 3 days away from signing a peace deal in Geneva that could reopen the global oil supply and stabilize the Middle East, even as the specific terms of that deal and the questions it leaves unanswered about nuclear programs and Lebanese sovereignty and Israeli strategic ambitions continue to generate the conditions for the next conflict. And what connects these two theaters, Ukraine and the Middle East, is the same fundamental question that has defined this entire era of global disorder. Whether the post-Cold War international order, already fractured by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, already strained by the 2026 Iran war and the Second Lebanon War and the destruction of the JCPOA nuclear framework, can be reassembled into something that prevents the next catastrophe, or whether what we are witnessing is not a series of crises, but the continuous unfolding of a single systemic breakdown. A world in which deterrence has failed. Diplomacy is reactive rather than preventive, and the rules that were supposed to protect UNESCO World Heritage sites and civilian populations and international shipping lanes are enforced only when it is politically convenient and ignored when the cost of enforcement is too high. Because today in Kyiv, a monastery that survived the Mongol invasions, survived the Napoleonic Wars, survived 2 world wars and the entire Soviet period, stands with its roof scorched and its cathedral damaged, and its priests still recovering irreplaceable Christian relics from beneath the debris. And Vladimir Putin's press secretary says Russia's military struck targets within the defense industrial complex and denies any responsibility for the monastery damage, the same denial Russia issues every time it strikes a hospital or a school or a market or a cultural heritage site. And in Geneva, in 3 days, a peace agreement will be signed that could mark the end of the most dangerous military confrontation between the United States and a major regional power since the Korean War. And what happens in the weeks and months after that signing, whether the Strait of Hormuz actually reopens and stays open, whether Iran accepts nuclear inspections, whether Israel stands down in Lebanon, whether the economic damage of the war begins to heal, will determine whether June 19, 2026 is remembered as the day the world stepped back from the edge, or simply as the day the world paused before taking the next step forward into it.